really owns the land of Israel, and why does it matter so much today? Well, Charles Dyer joins us. Let's go to the interview. What makes the land of Israel so central to the Arab-Israeli conflict?
Yeah, thanks. It really is. It's all about the land and ultimately about who has the rights to own that land.
Hmm.
Is it the God of the Bible or is it the God of Islam? And that's why a lot of the world hasn't understood. They approach it secular in a secular way, but in
Yeah.
reality, it's a religious conflict.
Yeah. From the beginning of time, right?
That's
From
right.
just about the beginning. And so, how does the Bible influence the debate over who owns the land?
Well, that's where I have to start. I think we start with what did God say? And if you go through the book of Genesis, in Genesis 12, God calls Abraham, and he named him Abram at that time. And he said, I've got a piece of land for you in Genesis 12. Genesis 13, God repeats that call. In Genesis 15, God actually cuts the covenant with Abraham. He makes the agreement, if you will, and tells him, this is your land. And only God passes through the parts of the animal that are cut apart there, meaning God is guaranteeing this on his life. A little bit later in Genesis, Abraham has a son named Ishmael, and God says, I'm going to bless him, but the promise is through your son Isaac, who hadn't even been born yet. And then when Isaac is born, God reaffirms that covenant and says, through Isaac, your seed will be called. Later, God passes that from Isaac to Jacob and promises him that he and his descendants would own the land that God promised them. So you go over and over again. If it were there just once, maybe you'd question it. But it's multiple times God is saying, this is the land I promised you. And he even lays out the land boundaries in Numbers 34. God describes the boundaries of the land. In Ezekiel 47, after Israel's taken out of the land, God says, you're going to come back someday. And he gives the final land boundaries, and they're identical to what he gave before. God never stuttered when he gave his promise. It just keeps coming over and over again.
Amen to that for sure. And we see this all through your book as you titled Who Owns the Land? And in this book, you explain to an in-depth look at the truth behind the Middle East conflict. Is the conflict more about religion or politics in your view?
Well, and that's where I think the West has gone wrong. We've assumed it's politics. We assume people talk about religion in the West, but we separate church and state. So it's really more about land, economics, other issues. In the Middle East, it's all about the religion. And it comes down to ultimately whose God is making the right promise, whose God is God. Because we
Mhm.
have very clearly what God promised in the book of Genesis. A lot of Christians might say, yeah, but the church has replaced Israel. And yet in Romans 9, 10, and 11, the one place in the New Testament where it talks about the relationship of the church and Israel, Paul says God's gifts and his calling to the Jewish people are irrevocable. And he
Mhm.
describes a time when Israel will be back and experiencing all the blessings. And in a sense, he says, because God made a promise and God doesn't go back on that promise.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, Islam teaches a replacement theology. It teaches uh, that Allah has taken away the promises from the Jews and from the church and given them to the Muslims,
Mhm.
and to the followers of Islam. And so it really comes down to which which promises from God are the right ones.
Mhm.
And neither side will relinquish on it. So that's why it makes it such an intractable problem, because it's not about the real estate. If
Mhm.
they made a state for Palestine, they would be happy, and then they'd want the rest of the land because they claim it all, just like Israel claims it all.
Because I think that people need to know more about the God of Israel. And so, how did the recent events in the Middle East fit into the biblical and historical narrative?
Well, and sadly, it fits in the way that God says, as the end times approach, as He sends the Messiah back, whose feet are someday going to stand again on the Mount of Olives and fulfill His promises that He made to the nation of Israel. But as that day approaches, it talks about all the world turning against Israel. The nations will turn, and in Zechariah he says those who do will be injuring themselves in that
Mm.
process. So in reality, we're seeing the setting of the stage, if you will, for those end times,
Mhm.
because as the nations turn against God, sorry, as the nations turn against Israel, they're turning against God. And Genesis 12:3 is still the foundation. If we want to know how God's going to deal with the nations as nations, God said in Genesis 12:3 to Abram, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse.
Mhm.
And what we're seeing is as nations turn against God, they turn against Israel. They're actually turning against God, and God will judge them for that. And that's what
Yeah.
we're starting to see.
How can this help someone who might be in, looking at the Israel's history?
Oh, well, the typical American is terrible when it comes to history and geography. I keep thinking of those people who said, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, but they didn't know what river they were talking about or what sea they were talking about. Well, they're pretty average Americans. We're terrible in geography, and yet this is a geographical problem. And we're
Mm,
terrible in history, and yet we truly do need to know the history, or we can be led astray by those who are very slick in how they present material. But
mm,
we need to know the background. And so the purpose for the book originally, when Stan Ellison wrote it, was to help people get the full background of how this
mhm.
problem came to be. And then he passed away, and I did one revision. Now this one, but it's trying to bring it up to date. What happened in the last 34 years, which
Right,
is
right,
rather dramatic. But if we
right.
don't know the history, we can be led astray. The more we know what happened and why it happened, the more we can understand the background for the current events.
Yeah. So how does it tie into prophecy at all? Like how you wrote it out as you're updating it?
I think it does. Now, again, the goal was to try and focus on the history side and put it together. But in reality, history is really his story, and his story continues on into the future. We
Yeah.
do know that God has promised that land to Israel. We know that Satan and his minions want to do everything they can to destroy God's plan and program for this world, which means they come against Israel. In fact, I'm convinced anti-Semitism has Satan's fingerprints all over it. And so we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing Satan at work, even in the anti-Semitic incidents we're seeing today. But we also know that God has laid out the basic plan of what's going to happen in the future. There is a time of what's going to look like worldwide peace that turns into a terrible time of trouble, even more anti-Semitism that won't end until the Lord comes back. But indeed, Jesus is coming back. And as God describes the different events there, I think we're starting to see the characters of the world line up on stage, if you will. Ezekiel 38 and 39 describe an invasion from the far north, led with some allies that include Persia, which is Iran today. It
Mm-hmm.
mentions some other countries that are part of Turkey today. It mentions
Mm-hmm.
Libya, Sudan. All those countries are suddenly on the world stage, uniting together and uniting in a way that's opposing Israel. And while it
Yeah.
might look bad for the Jewish state at times, we know God's in control. He already announced this, and he
Mm-hmm.
also told us how that battle's going to end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when you're in Israel, what is the thing that Israel would like the world to know about them?
I think a couple things. One, it's a small country. Most Americans try and put Israel into U.S. size, and you're in New Jersey. It's really the size of New Jersey, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that is the Negev, the desert in the south. So it's very small. I think they'd like people to know that by and large, most Israelis are not overly religious. They'd be happy to get along with those around them, and in fact, sadly, many of those who were killed on October 7 were in kibbutzes that were very peace oriented kibbutzes right along the border with Gaza. I think they'd like people to know that they've what they've been through. The Holocaust was a horrendous event when the Jewish people were literally hunted down to be killed by the Nazis for doing nothing but being Jewish. Even when some of them were very pro-German at the time, very secular, and yet Hitler was after them. October 7 was the same thing. The reason that those 1,200 people were killed was for being Jewish, not for
Mm-hmm.
anything else. They were not fighting. They were not at war with Gaza. It was
Mm-hmm.
Gaza that had invaded. And I think if they want people to go and see it, see the land, see the people, see what they've done with the land, see the horrible things that have been done to them, so that
Mm-hmm.
people could have a different perspective. Because what we hear in the news is just it's. I remember in court they say tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Some of what we're seeing are snatches of truth, but they're not the whole truth.
Yeah.
And indeed, they're presenting something that in our media comes across as distorted.
Yeah. And it's just a fraction, like you say, it's just a fraction of what really we see. And there's a lot of Israel, like if you go on YouTube, you can see Israel news there. So if anybody really wants to know what's going on, you know, go on Israel, on YouTube, on an Israel news channel, and you can see up-to-date information. But so what's happening? Is Gaza like that thread in the prophecy?
Uh, I don't think so. I think it's partly there, but I think the real threat in the prophecy are some of the major players around. We do know again, Iran is mentioned, Russia's mentioned, Turkey is mentioned.
Hmm.
We know that other nations are mentioned around there. We know Gaza is there. They were originally the Philistines in that land. By the way, the people in Gaza today, the Palestinians, are not the descendants of the Canaanites or the Philistines, as they try and claim for the land. They are the descendants of everybody who came through that land through history, which is why there are blonde haired, blue eyed people in Gaza and very dark skinned people in Gaza. It was just part of that land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. So
Hmm.
Gaza will play a minor role, I think, in end time prophecy, but indeed it's going to be the major powers around, and especially
Yeah.
with the Antichrist, this future world leader who comes from the West, who's going to
Mhm.
play an even larger outsized role.
That's an interesting thought right there.
Yeah, well, we're
Yeah.
we're seeing. I think if anything we're seeing today is that Israel wants peace, and it seems to be strong leaders from the West are what they're going to pin their hope on for peace.
Hmm.
And as the end times come, that's what is going to happen. And it's interesting.
Hmm.
It's not just right wing or left wing. President Obama came in offering hope for peace, and the Arabs liked what he said. President Trump comes in offering hope for peace. The Jewish side likes what he says. Someday someone's going to come and succeed where all these others have not quite been able to pull it off. And when
Hmm.
that happens, that person who will win the Nobel Peace Prize will be the Antichrist.
Yeah. Oh, and you know what? It's going to happen like this because that's how God raises them up, right?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. He's
and
not known
Satan.
now, but he will be rather rapidly. And again, Satan will energize him and will work out that plan to get it
Yep.
all to come together.
Yep. And so now let me ask you this question. So what personal experiences shaped your perspective on this issue of the Middle East biblical and historical narrative?
Actually, a great question because it started when I was about 15 years old. The 1967 Six-Day War. I was working on a farm in the summer, and it was the first time I ever met someone who truly was anti-Semitic. The Six-Day War started, and through all of his cursing and everything else, he said the Jews are going to be pushed into the sea. They're rotten. I mean, it just all this hatred he had for Israel. Well, I didn't know anything, but I just knew that that couldn't be right. And so I said to him, "That's not going to happen. They're going to win." I had no idea. And indeed, the Six-Day War is what piqued my interest on what is this nation of Israel, and why would people be so angry, so evil, so opposed to them? Well, then
Mm.
I went to a Bible college, went to seminary, and I always knew I wanted to go to Israel. A once in a lifetime experience. And when I finally got to go in 1982, it wasn't a once in a lifetime experience. It was transformative in my life. It
Mm.
changed the goal of where I wanted to go. I wanted to go to Israel again and take people to Israel to help them understand, because they won't know the Bible unless they've been to Israel, and they truly won't know current events unless they've been to Israel.
Mm.
And that's what I've been doing for this 40 plus years since.
That's amazing. So I have to ask you this question. What's your favorite part of Israel?
Ah, my favorite part is the Judean wilderness between Jerusalem and Jericho. I love to take people there. We hike up this one mountain. They're thinking, what is this idiot doing? And they get to the top, they look over the whole wilderness, and I want to get up there ahead, turn around and watch their faces when they get there and they go, oh, wow. And then I open the Bible to Isaiah 40, and I
Wow.
say, here's the painting. You're looking at the canvas on which Isaiah painted Isaiah 40. And we just work our way through the passage and all the details that are there. And it's one of those powerful, moving passages. But when you read it in its historical context, it can change lives. And that's my favorite spot.
That's so great. So the picture I'm getting in my mind is beautiful. So I can imagine what it's like in person. This book was updated and revised. It was actually written by Stanley Ellison, but Charles has been adding to it because of the history. So, you can get Charles' book, Who Owns the Land, at Moody Publishers or on his website, charlesdyer.com. Charles, what would you like to leave my audience with today?
I'd like to leave them with probably this. If you want to be on God's good side, you want to have God to bless you. Make sure that you're a blessing to Israel and the Jewish people. Stand up for their right to exist in the land, and then read the Bible. The Bible doesn't begin in Matthew; it begins in Genesis. And to the extent that you read the Old Testament, you will understand more thoroughly the New Testament. So that's more than one thing to leave them with, but I hope that's enough. It's if they can read the Bible and stand up for Israel, they will be doing themselves a blessing, and they'll be blessing the Jewish people.
Thanks for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this interview, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more Christ-centered conversations. Visit my website, thecallwithNancySabato.com. Until next time, all glory and honor to King Jesus.